They trained for a morning that never arrived. Before sunrise, American soldiers rose from bunks across 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and North America, believing that today might be the last normal day of human history. Boots hit concrete floors. Radios crackled to life. Engines warmed in silence. Somewhere underground, men stared at clocks that could end the world. This was not paranoia. It was policy. For nearly half a century, the United States military existed in a permanent state of anticipation. Every drill, every patrol, every exercise was shaped by a single assumption. The next war would not be like the last one. It would be final. Unlike past conflicts, there would be no gradual escalation, no long mobilization, no warning shots. If war came, it would arrive in minutes, measured not in troop movements but in missile trajectories. American soldiers were trained under a terrifying truth. If the war began, there was a real chance no one would survive to see its end. Yet the training continued. From frozen radar stations above the Arctic Circle to tank ranges in West Germany, the U.S. military built itself around a war scenario that planners believed was inevitable. Soviet armored divisions were expected to pour through the Fulda Gap. Nuclear weapons would follow. Cities would vanish. Command structures would collapse. And still, orders were clear. Prepare anyway. Young recruits, barely out of high school, were handed field manuals that described battlefields poisoned by radiation. Pilots memorized flight paths that assumed they would never return. Infantry units rehearsed fighting while cut off, surrounded, and outnumbered. This was not courage driven by hope. It was discipline built on acceptance. Because in the Cold War, readiness was the only thing standing between peace and extinction. To the public, this war barely existed. There were no dramatic headlines, no battlefield footage, no victory maps on evening news broadcasts. Instead, it lived in classified documents, sealed bunkers, and the minds of soldiers who trained endlessly for a moment that never came. The irony was brutal. The better prepared they became, the less likely the war was to happen. And so America trained harder than ever before. When World War II ended, Americans believed peace had been won through sacrifice. The Axis powers were defeated. Europe lay in ruins. The United States stood unrivaled in military strength. But beneath the celebrations, a new reality was already forming. The Soviet Union emerged from the war bloodied but powerful, with millions of soldiers and a grip over Eastern Europe. Former allies became rivals almost overnight. Mutual suspicion hardened into strategy. Strategy hardened into doctrine. By the late 1940s, American intelligence concluded that another global war was not just possible, it was probable. Pentagon planners began sketching scenarios where Soviet forces launched a lightning assault across Europe. NATO war games were grim. In many simulations, Western defenses collapsed within weeks, sometimes days. American soldiers stationed overseas were told the truth in blunt terms. You will not win by advancing. You will win by surviving long enough for deterrence to work. This war would not be decided by heroism alone. It would be decided by restraint, calculation, and terrifying self-control. Training reflected this reality. Infantry units practiced operating after their commanders were killed. Pilots trained to fly through nuclear blast shockwaves. Missile crews drilled endlessly, learning to treat the most catastrophic order imaginable as just another checklist. Emotion had no place here. The Cold War soldier was expected to function, even as the world ended around him. What made this preparation unique in human history was not its scale, but its purpose. Every previous war had been trained for in order to be fought. This one was trained for so it would never happen. The logic was ruthless but clear. If the enemy believed the United States was ready to respond instantly and overwhelmingly, they would never attack in the first place. Peace would be preserved not through trust, but through fear. And so fear became institutionalized. Entire branches of the military existed solely to wait. Radar operators watched empty skies. Submarines patrolled oceans without targets. Strategic bombers flew endless routes, fully armed, prepared to turn keys that would change civilization forever. Years passed, then decades. Soldiers rotated in and out. Weapons systems evolved. Political leaders came and went. But the war plan remained updated, refined, rehearsed. Always waiting. Always ready. By the time many soldiers retired, the war they trained for had defined their entire adult lives. They never charged beaches. They never liberated cities. They never saw the enemy they were prepared to kill. Instead, they carried something heavier. The knowledge that the fate of millions depended on their discipline, their restraint, and their willingness to obey or refuse orders under unimaginable pressure. This is the story of those soldiers. Not of battles fought, but of wars prevented. Not of victories celebrated, but of disasters avoided. Not of explosions, but of silence. Because sometimes, the most important wars in history are the ones that never happen. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, Americans believed they had earned a generation of peace. The enemy had surrendered. Europe was liberated. The Pacific was secured. For the first time in years, the world exhaled. But inside the Pentagon, no one relaxed. Because even as victory parades marched down city streets, intelligence reports told a colder story. The Soviet Union had not merely survived the war, it had emerged transformed. Its armies were massive, battle-hardened, and positioned across Eastern Europe. Its ideology was uncompromising, and its leaders believed, just as firmly as Washington did, that the next war would decide the future of humanity. The alliance of necessity collapsed almost overnight. In Berlin, former allies stared at each other across rubble-strewn streets. In Eastern Europe, borders hardened into walls. Nations that had existed for centuries vanished behind new regimes. By the late 1940s, American planners no longer asked whether the Soviet Union was a threat. They asked how long before it moved. The enemy in this war did not announce itself with gunfire. It announced itself with silence. U.S. intelligence assessments were blunt. If war erupted in Europe, Soviet forces would not advance slowly. They would strike with overwhelming speed and numbers. Tank armies, thousands strong, were expected to surge through Central Europe. NATO's forward defenses would be crushed, airfields destroyed, command centers targeted within minutes. In many war games, Western Europe fell in under 30 days. Sometimes less. American soldiers stationed in Germany were told this reality without comfort. They were not there to win in the traditional sense. They were there to delay the inevitable, to slow the advance long enough for political leaders to decide whether to unleash nuclear weapons. This knowledge shaped everything. Training emphasized fighting while retreating. Units practiced holding ground they knew they could not keep. Officers drilled scenarios where reinforcements never arrived. Soldiers learned that survival was not guaranteed and was never promised. The Cold War battlefield was not heroic. It was mathematical. The Soviet soldier became an abstraction in American training manuals. He was not depicted as an individual, but as a force of nature, endless, disciplined, and relentless. Intelligence briefings emphasized numbers over faces, divisions over names, doctrine over emotion. This dehumanization was not cruelty, it was necessity. To function under the expectation of catastrophic war, American soldiers were taught to think in terms of systems, not sentiments. They studied enemy equipment, enemy formations, enemy doctrine, but rarely the enemy's voice. Because in this war, empathy could be dangerous. Yet despite the tension, the first shot was never fired. Year after year, crisis after crisis, the world approached the brink and stepped back. Berlin airlifts replaced invasions. Missile deployments replaced offensives. Rhetoric replaced gunfire. From the outside, it appeared as restraint. From inside the military, it felt like constant suspense. Alerts were frequent. Exercises blurred into reality. Soldiers learned to treat every alarm as real until proven otherwise. They slept with gear packed. Pilots lived within minutes of takeoff. Radar operators stared into empty skies for hours, knowing that one signal, one mistake, could mean the difference between peace and annihilation. The enemy was always there, just never visible. What made this confrontation unprecedented was its asymmetry. Neither side could afford to strike first. Neither side could afford to hesitate. Deterrence demanded perfection, not courage but consistency. American soldiers were trained to believe something deeply unsettling. Their greatest success would look like nothing at all. No medals, no headlines, no victory. Just another day where the war did not start. As decades passed, this logic hardened into doctrine. Generations of soldiers inherited the same mission: maintain readiness without provocation, strength without aggression, control without release. They trained not for glory, but for balance. And so the Cold War soldier became a paradox, armed beyond imagination, yet ordered never to fire, prepared for devastation, yet measured by restraint. The enemy never attacked, but the preparation never stopped. Because in this war, the absence of conflict was not proof of safety. It was proof that the system was working. If the war came, it would not begin with marching armies or distant artillery. It would begin with light. A flash brighter than the sun. A shockwave faster than sound. And then silence followed by fire. American soldiers were trained to accept this as a starting point. From the 1950s onward, U.S. military doctrine quietly acknowledged a truth that was never spoken aloud to the public. Any major war with the Soviet Union would almost certainly turn nuclear. Conventional battles would not decide the outcome. They would only determine how long it took before the world crossed a point of no return. So soldiers trained not just to fight, but to function after the unthinkable. On training grounds across the United States and Europe, men learned how to operate in environments poisoned by radiation. They memorized contamination symbols. They practiced navigating terrain where time itself was lethal, where staying too long in one place could kill you days later. Gas masks were worn until breathing felt unnatural. Protective suits turned movement into exhaustion. Simple tasks became slow, clumsy, and dangerous. Weapons were harder to grip, radios harder to hear, vision narrowed to tunnels of glass and rubber. This was not preparation for comfort. It was preparation for survival. Field manuals explained radiation exposure in clinical terms: measured, calculated, and disturbingly calm. Casualty estimates were treated as variables. Entire units were expected to continue fighting even after suffering losses that would have ended any previous war. For the first time in history, soldiers trained under the assumption that the battlefield itself would try to kill them even if the enemy didn't. Command training was equally brutal. Officers rehearsed scenarios where headquarters were destroyed within minutes, orders stopped coming, communications collapsed, leaders were killed. Surviving soldiers were expected to continue the mission anyway. Decentralized command became essential. Every soldier was trained to act independently if necessary. Every unit practiced operating while cut off, surrounded, and unsupported. In nuclear war, there would be no second chances. For pilots, the reality was even starker. Strategic bomber crews trained for missions with no expectation of return. Flight paths assumed enemy airspace saturated with defenses. Targets were selected not for military elegance, but for deterrent value. Crews memorized procedures designed to function, even if command authority no longer existed. Submarine crews drilled in total isolation, prepared to carry out launch orders weeks or months after the world above them had changed forever. They trained to act without confirmation, without reassurance, and without contact with home. These were not just technical exercises. They were psychological conditioning. Because hesitation could mean failure, and failure could mean extinction. Yet despite the grimness, discipline held. American soldiers learned to compartmentalize fear. Training emphasized repetition until actions became instinct. The goal was not bravery, but reliability. You did not need to be fearless. You needed to be predictable. This philosophy extended across the entire military. Missile crews practiced turning keys in perfect synchronization. Radar operators drilled until response times were measured in seconds. Infantry units rehearsed movement patterns designed to minimize exposure, not maximize aggression. Every element of the system existed to send one message to the enemy: "We are ready, do not test us." The paradox was cruel. The more realistic the training became, the more soldiers understood that survival was unlikely. Yet this knowledge did not weaken resolve, it hardened it. Because in the Cold War, purpose did not come from hope of victory. It came from duty. The duty to be prepared. The duty to stand watch. The duty to ensure that, no matter the cost, the war never began. By the late Cold War, generations of American soldiers had trained for conditions no human had ever experienced. They were equipped for environments humanity had never truly endured. They were asked to remain calm in scenarios that defied imagination. And still, day after day, the war did not come. But training continued. Because readiness in this war was not about expecting to win. It was about ensuring the enemy never tried. For most soldiers, military life is a rhythm of action and consequence. Drill, mission, combat, and then reflection. Success is measured in victories, medals, or the tangible relief of survival. But for the Cold War soldier, life was different. The measure of success was often invisible. The war they trained for, the war their entire career prepared them to fight, never arrived. Enlist in 1955, retire in 1975, and in those 20 years, a soldier could see tens of thousands of drills, exercises, and alerts, and never fire a single shot in anger. Entire units were stationed in Europe, standing guard over borders that never moved. Infantry platoons patrolled forests and valleys where no enemy tanks rolled. Pilots flew endless sorties along phantom routes. Missile crews counted minutes and seconds, knowing a single misstep could trigger unimaginable consequences. The life of these soldiers was defined not by combat, but by constant expectation. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that at any moment your world could change. The sirens might sound, orders could arrive. You might be called to launch weapons capable of annihilating cities, nations, even continents. Yet most days nothing happened. The tension never disappeared. It was always there, a low hum beneath every task, every patrol, every report. Many veterans later described the feeling as waiting on a precipice. Unlike combat, where fear is punctuated by action, this was a fear without resolution. Every drill, every warning, every exercise reminded them of the potential apocalypse looming just beyond the horizon. And unlike in war, where victory or defeat brings closure, here there was only preparation and waiting. Some soldiers coped through routine, others through camaraderie, humor, or personal routines that made the relentless anticipation bearable. But the psychological cost was real. Anxiety, insomnia, and hypervigilance were common. And unlike soldiers returning from combat, the world rarely understood or acknowledged their invisible sacrifices. Yet there was also a paradoxical pride. Being part of this unseen front line was both terrifying and meaningful. These soldiers carried a responsibility heavier than most could imagine. Their very readiness, maintained day in and day out, served as a deterrent. It was their presence, their training, their vigilance that made the war less likely to happen. Generations of soldiers came to understand something that civilians could not. Their greatest victories were measured in silence. Each year without conflict, each successful deterrent, each avoided escalation was a testament to their discipline and resilience. Training never stopped. War games evolved, weapon systems improved, and new technology was introduced. Soldiers who had once learned to operate radios by hand now mastered computers, missile systems, and early warning networks. Each innovation brought new responsibilities, new drills, and new exercises, all reinforcing the same ultimate goal: preparedness for a conflict that might never come. Yet this perpetual readiness shaped not just military careers but identities. Soldiers who joined as young men or women left decades later profoundly changed. They were trained for extreme, unimaginable situations. They had been conditioned to respond to orders under pressure beyond most comprehension. They had faced fear day after day, without release. Some retired quietly, seeking civilian life. Others remained within military structures, passing knowledge to new generations. And even as the Cold War neared its end, they carried with them the same vigilance and awareness that had defined their entire careers. This was a life defined not by action, but by anticipation, not by combat, but by preparation, not by victories celebrated, but by disasters prevented. The soldiers of the Cold War waited, trained, and endured, fully aware that the war they prepared for might never come, and yet knowing that their readiness alone might ensure it never would. Even the best-trained soldiers operating under perfect discipline cannot control every variable. For decades, the Cold War teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The war that never came close, more than once. False radar signals, misinterpreted exercises, human error. Each incident was a reminder of how fragile peace could be when billions of lives rested on a few decisions, some made by young officers in the middle of the night. In October 1962, the world stood closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. American reconnaissance discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, less than 90 miles from U.S. shores. For 13 tense days, U.S. forces were on high alert. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen prepared for immediate action. Bombers loaded. Submarines patrolled with nuclear weapons ready. Yet in the midst of uncertainty, decisions made by individuals, leaders in Washington, Soviet officers in Cuba, and U.S. military commanders, prevented disaster. Restraint, calculation, and communication allowed the world to step back from the edge. Soldiers trained for total annihilation never fired a single shot. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Berlin was a flashpoint. Soviet forces threatened to cut off Western access. American units stationed in West Germany practiced responding to an invasion that might never occur, but each alert was treated as real. Troops loaded weapons, armored vehicles were deployed, and missile units went on high alert, all under the belief that conflict could erupt at any moment. Again, diplomacy and timing prevented escalation. Soldiers never fired, tanks never clashed, and yet the training and readiness displayed by U.S. forces were a key reason the Soviets hesitated. Perhaps the closest the Cold War came to a global disaster was during Able Archer 83, a NATO command exercise simulating nuclear war. The Soviets, unaware it was a drill, interpreted NATO maneuvers as preparation for an actual attack. Nuclear forces were readied on both sides. American soldiers, following precise protocols, executed every step perfectly, without provoking the other side. Communication channels, command discipline, and adherence to procedure prevented accidental escalation. One misstep, one misinterpreted order, and the world could have ended in fire. These near misses reinforced a truth every Cold War soldier understood. Preparation alone was never enough. Discipline, judgment, and restraint were as critical as firepower. Training for war was constant, but so was the awareness that a single mistake could trigger the very conflict they hoped to prevent. Each alert, each drill, each exercise was a test, not of courage but of control. The irony was profound. Soldiers prepared for annihilation. They practiced scenarios where millions would die. Yet their greatest victories were invisible, measured not in conquest but in what did not happen. These near misses were silent lessons that reverberated through the ranks. A war could come close, yet still be avoided, if the men and women trained for it remained calm, disciplined, and ready. And through it all the world remained intact. The war never began. When the Cold War finally ended, there were no parades, no fireworks, no victory speeches. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the ideological conflict that had defined generations of soldiers quietly came to an end. For the men and women who had spent decades preparing for the ultimate confrontation, the conclusion was profoundly anticlimactic. There was no battlefield to walk across, no captured flags to raise, no enemy soldiers to acknowledge defeat. Their victory was invisible, silent, uncelebrated. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the United States military had invested enormous resources in deterrence. Entire bases were built, weapons developed, and troops trained with unparalleled intensity. Soldiers learned to operate in conditions no human had ever faced: nuclear fallout, chemical threats, and battlefield environments where command structures could collapse in seconds. Yet none of this was ever tested in combat. Every plan, every simulation, every alert served one goal: to prevent the war from ever starting. For the soldiers, decades of vigilance shaped their lives. Families moved near bases that might be targets. Children grew up with parents who were always alert, always ready, even when nothing seemed to happen. Holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries often passed in tense expectation rather than celebration. Many veterans later reflected on the psychological cost. Living in constant anticipation without ever releasing tension through combat left invisible scars. Anxiety, hypervigilance, and the constant hum of potential disaster became routine. Yet there was pride, too. They understood that their readiness, their discipline, was a critical deterrent. The war never came because they were prepared for it. The Cold War proved that sometimes victory is measured not in explosions or conquered territory, but in what does not happen. The world was safe, not because conflict was impossible, but because preparation, restraint, and deterrence worked. The soldiers who had trained tirelessly to respond to annihilation had, in effect, fought the war without firing a single shot. They maintained a delicate balance on a knife's edge, ensuring that political and military tensions never escalated into nuclear catastrophe. As the Cold War ended, weapons systems were dismantled, bases closed, troops were reassigned or retired. Generals and planners updated doctrines to reflect a world where the immediate nuclear threat had receded, yet the lessons of constant vigilance endured. Veterans carried the knowledge that their careers mattered even without combat, and that their service had preserved peace. Future generations of soldiers would inherit equipment, strategy, and doctrine shaped by the untested, but successful, deterrent strategies of these unsung warriors. The war that had defined their lives had never happened, and in that absence lay their greatest achievement. Peace for decades had been maintained by silent readiness, invisible planning, and the unwavering discipline of men and women prepared to fight a war that, in the end, the world never saw. The Cold War ended quietly, but its legacy was anything but small. The soldiers who trained for a war that never came left behind a profound mark on America, the world, and the very concept of military power. Their influence was structural, psychological, and cultural, shaping not only how wars are prepared for but how peace is maintained. The soldiers of the Cold War created the foundation of the modern U.S. military. Bases, protocols, and command structures developed during decades of preparation remain active in some form today. Missile silos, radar networks, and rapid response units, once intended for a war that never erupted, became cornerstones of national security. New technologies were tested and perfected under the pressures of readiness. Satellite surveillance, nuclear command and control systems, and early warning detection were refined with the understanding that any failure could be catastrophic. Even today, these systems trace their lineage back to the men and women who trained tirelessly for battles they never fought. The Cold War soldiers' discipline created an invisible shield. Their very preparedness ensured that adversaries thought twice before taking action. The deterrence they embodied did not rely on bullets or bombs. It relied on credibility and consistency. Entire generations of potential conflict were avoided not because leaders wanted peace, but because the military was capable of devastating retaliation. This paradox, where preparation for war maintains peace, became the defining doctrine of the nuclear age. Soldiers were the backbone of this quiet but effective global strategy. The human cost of perpetual readiness left its own imprint. Soldiers carried the weight of living with a potential apocalypse at their fingertips. Stress, hypervigilance, and the invisible burden of responsibility were common. Many veterans described the Cold War as a life spent on edge, where every decision, every drill, and every alert could have changed the course of history. Yet there was also pride. Unlike most wars, there were no unnecessary casualties, no cities destroyed, no nations decimated. Their service, quiet, unseen, and uncelebrated, was a victory of discipline over chaos. The story of soldiers trained for a war that never came teaches something profound about human conflict. Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with preparation, restraint, and vigilance. Sometimes the most important victories are invisible, measured not by the destruction prevented but by the lives saved. These soldiers prove that readiness is a kind of power, a silent, enduring, and decisive force. Their influence extended beyond the battlefield, shaping strategy, diplomacy, and the very notion of deterrence for decades to come. Today, few remember the Cold War soldier outside history books. Their names rarely appear in headlines. Yet the world they helped preserve exists largely as they envisioned, free from the conflict they prepared for, guided by the discipline and foresight of those who spent their lives ready to act, and never had to. The war that never came was not a failure. It was a triumph of preparation over combat, anticipation over chaos, and discipline over panic. In the end, the greatest battlefield of all was silence, and in that silence, these soldiers won a war that no one ever witnessed.